Chapter 1. The Silent Encounter. The sterile white walls of the hospital stood as silent sentinels, guarding the flow of life and death within its corridors. The scent of antiseptic hung in the air, a reminder that this was a place where pain was mended, or at least subdued. Outside, the muted glow of a gray evening was beginning to fade, casting long shadows on the polished floors. Marco arrived under a shroud of urgency. His body, muscular and scarred from years in a life of crime, was now fragile, teetering on the edge of survival. He was no stranger to blood or pain, but today was different. The wound in his abdomen was deep, a consequence of loyalty and betrayal tangled within the violent web of the Mafia world he called home. His arrival, orchestrated by shadowy figures in silence, was untraceable. No names, no questions. He lay on the gurney as it was rushed into the emergency ward, surrounded by the faceless efficiency of doctors and nurses who moved around him like clockwork. His consciousness drifted in and out, barely tethered to reality. The bright lights above blurred and softened, casting an ethereal glow around the figures who worked to stabilize his condition. It was a surreal sensation, one of floating between worlds. The brutal streets he knew and this unfamiliar realm of sterile care. Amidst the chaos, she appeared, Elena. Her presence, though not commanding, carried a quiet strength that made her stand out. She moved with purpose, her white coat fluttering slightly as she approached Marco's gurney. Her face was calm, serene even, her eyes steady as they met the sight of his broken form. Her hands, practiced and delicate, began their work without hesitation, applying pressure to the wound, controlling the bleeding. For Elena, Marco was just another patient at first glance, another body in need of repair. But there was something different about him. The scars that laced his skin told stories, and the tension in his face spoke of a life lived on the edge. She could sense the weight of his existence, the darkness that clung to him like a shadow. Yet, there was no judgment in her eyes, only focus, only care. Her hands worked methodically, cleaning the wound and preparing him for surgery. As she moved, Marco's gaze flickered to her. Through the haze of pain and morphine, he could see her clearly for the first time. His vision swam, but her face remained sharp in his mind. Her soft features, her calm presence. There was something grounding about her, something that pulled him back from the brink. The sterile surroundings faded, and for a moment, it was just her and him in a silent understanding. Time passed slowly, and Marco was eventually wheeled into the operating room. Elena followed, watching as the surgical team prepared to do what they could to save him. She wasn't part of the surgery, but she lingered just long enough to ensure that he was stable, to make sure that her efforts had been enough to give him a fighting chance. As the night wore on, Marco's body was stitched and mended under the sharp gaze of the surgeons, while Elena moved on to other patients. Yet, her mind occasionally drifted back to the man on the gurney. She had seen plenty of patients, each with their own stories, many of them tragic, but something about him lingered in her thoughts. Maybe it was the way his eyes had met hers, or perhaps it was the unspoken weight of the life he carried, hidden behind his silence. Hours later, Marco was moved to a private recovery room, his body still but his mind slowly stirring. The surgery had been successful. The blood loss was under control, the wound was closed. But his recovery would be slow. He lay still, his chest rising and falling rhythmically under the thin hospital sheets. His mind, though foggy, was beginning to sharpen again. He was alive, and through the dull throb of pain, he remembered her face. The calm, the quiet, the way her hands had moved with such precision. Elena passed by the room later that night, her shift nearly over. She stopped outside the door, peering in through the small window. There he was, resting now, his face softened by sleep. She observed him for a moment, wondering what kind of life he led. The scars, the tension in his body, even while he slept, it all pointed to a man who lived on the edge of something dangerous. She turned away and moved down the hallway, her footsteps soft against the linoleum floor. Outside, the night had fully settled, and the hospital remained a world of quiet urgency. Life and death, healing and pain, all continued in their steady rhythm, as they always did. And yet, amidst it all, a silent connection had begun to form, unspoken, unnoticed by anyone else, but there nonetheless. Marco lay alone in his room, unaware that his life had just been changed in a way he could never have anticipated. His world, one of violence and shadows, had briefly collided with a world of healing and light. And though neither of them knew it yet, that brief encounter would set the stage for something far more profound. The night continued its course, wrapping the hospital in its quiet embrace. For now, the two worlds remained separate, but the bond that had been unknowingly forged would soon draw them together again. Chapter 2. Unseen Ties. The days passed slowly for Marco in the sterile confines of his hospital room. Time, usually so fluid and quick in his world, felt heavy here, stretching out as his body began its slow recovery. His wound, though healing, throbbed constantly beneath the bandages. The ache was a constant reminder of the life he lived, a life where violence was routine and survival was never guaranteed. The hospital had its own rhythm, one that Marco wasn't accustomed to. It was quiet here, a stark contrast to the world he knew. The steady beeping of machines, the soft footsteps of nurses, the occasional rush of an emergency, it all felt distant, as if the hospital operated on a different frequency than the life Marco was used to navigating. He remained still most of the time, allowing his body to rest, but his mind was never quiet. His thoughts drifted back to the events that had brought him here. The meeting that had gone wrong, the sharp, unexpected pain, the hands that had pulled him into the car. He could still see flashes of the night in his mind. The blinding headlights, the dark alley, the blood soaking through his shirt. But in all those memories, there was one image that stood out, clear and unwavering. Elena. She had been there, a steady presence in the chaos of his arrival. Her face, calm and focused, had become a point of fixation for him during those hazy moments between life and death. Even now, as he lay recovering, her image lingered in his thoughts. It wasn't just her beauty. It was the way she had carried herself, the way her hands had moved with such certainty. In his world, certainty was rare, and trust even rarer. But in that moment, he had trusted her completely, without words, without question. Marco's daily routine in the hospital was uneventful. Nurses came and went, checking his vitals, adjusting his medications, and ensuring that his recovery was on track. He observed them with quiet detachment, offering little more than a nod or a glance in acknowledgement. His body was healing, but his mind was restless, constantly scanning, constantly aware. Old habits from his life outside these walls refused to fade. Occasionally, Elena would pass by his room during her rounds. She never lingered, but each time she did, Marco felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Her presence was like a current in the air, subtle but undeniable. He never spoke to her, never even made an attempt to engage her, but their silent exchanges were enough. She would glance in, her eyes scanning the monitors, checking his progress, and then she would move on. Yet, in those brief moments, a wordless connection continued to build between them. Elena was aware of him too. Her life as a doctor was filled with patients, each with their own stories, but Marco stood out in a way she couldn't quite explain. She never asked questions about him. His chart revealed only the essentials: gunshot wound, surgery, recovery, his past, his affiliations, the life that had led him to that moment. None of it was recorded in the neat, orderly notes attached to his bed, but she could sense that he was different. There was an intensity to him, even in his silence. Elena noticed the way he carried himself, even in his weakened state. He was watchful, always aware of his surroundings, his eyes sharp even when his body was still. It was as if he were waiting for something, or someone. He wasn't just another patient to her, though she treated him with the same professionalism she offered to all. There was a quiet curiosity growing inside her, a need to understand the man behind the scars. Days turned into weeks, and Marco's condition improved. The wound healed, leaving behind yet another scar to add to the collection already marking his body. He began to move more, testing his strength, slowly regaining control over his body. The nurses took note of his progress, and though he remained distant, they reported favorably on his recovery. But Marco wasn't just healing physically. His mind, too, was slowly adjusting to this new environment. The quiet of the hospital, the absence of violence, the structured, almost predictable flow of time. It was different, but it wasn't entirely unwelcome. For the first time in years, Marco found himself without an immediate threat, without the constant pressure of the life he had lived. Here, he was just another patient, a man in recovery. Yet, his old life was never far from his thoughts. He knew that once he left these walls, he would be drawn back into the same dangerous world that had almost killed him. The Mafia was not something you simply walked away from. There were debts to be paid, loyalties to honor, and enemies to avoid. Marco was acutely aware of the thin line he walked between survival and death, even as he lay in the relative safety of the hospital. But then, there was Elena. She was the unexpected element in his recovery, the one thing that didn't fit into the life he knew. She represented something he couldn't quite define, something softer, something good. He wasn't used to that. In his world, people were either useful or dangerous, trustworthy or deceptive. Elena didn't fit into any of those categories. She was just there, and for some reason, that mattered. Marco began to anticipate her passing by his room. He never admitted it to himself, but there was a quiet comfort in those moments when their eyes would meet. It was always brief, always fleeting, but it was enough. Elena, too, found herself lingering just a little longer each time she passed. She couldn't explain it. There was no logical reason for her to feel drawn to him, but the pull was there, unspoken and undeniable. As the days continued, the bond between them, though invisible, began to deepen. It was a bond that neither of them fully understood, one built on silence and unspoken moments. But it was there, growing with each passing day. And though neither of them knew what the future held, they both sensed that this connection, this unseen tie, was not something they could easily walk away from. Marco's recovery was almost complete, and soon he would leave the hospital, returning to the world that had shaped him. But something had changed. The man who had arrived on the gurney, broken and bleeding, was not the same man who would leave. And the doctor who had once been a stranger was now something more. A connection to a different life. A life Marco had never thought possible. As the hospital continued its quiet rhythm, life outside its walls waited for Marco. But for now, in this moment, the world was still, and the bond between Marco and Elena remained unseen but undeniable. Chapter 3: The Crossroads. The hospital room, once an unfamiliar place of vulnerability for Marco, had become a temporary sanctuary. His body was healing, and with each passing day, he felt his strength returning. The once deep wound in his abdomen had closed, leaving behind a fresh scar, a mark that would remind him of the night his life had almost ended. But more than that, it was a reminder of the life he was slipping away from, even if just for a moment. Marco had spent most of his time in quiet reflection. The hospital's slow, monotonous pace offered him something he hadn't had in years: time to think, time to breathe. But with the clarity that came with recovery, so too did the reality of his situation. The world outside these walls was waiting for him, and it wasn't a world that would allow him the peace he found here. Elena had become a quiet constant in his life. Though they exchanged no words, her presence was one he looked for every day. She moved through the hospital like a whisper, her white coat catching the soft glow of the hospital lights as she tended to her patients. Marco noticed the way she treated each person with the same gentle care, her hands working with practiced precision, her eyes focused but filled with a quiet empathy. He had never known someone like her, someone who existed outside the brutality of the world he came from. Elena represented something foreign to him, something good and untouched by the violence that had shaped his life. She didn't belong in the world he knew. and yet, for reasons he couldn't fully understand, he found himself drawn to her. It wasn't just her beauty, though he couldn't deny that. It was the way she carried herself, the way she moved with purpose and grace, as if the weight of the world couldn't touch her. But Marco knew better than to let himself believe in such things. His life had been shaped by the choices he made, and those choices had consequences. He couldn't escape who he was, and he couldn't drag someone like Elena into that darkness. Yet, every time their paths crossed in the quiet of the hospital, something in him shifted. There was a calmness that settled over him when she was near, a momentary reprieve from the constant tension he carried with him. Elena, too, found herself thinking of Marco more often than she cared to admit. His recovery had been remarkable, and his physical strength was evident in the way he moved now. But it wasn't just his body that intrigued her. It was the unspoken weight he carried in his eyes, the silent intensity that seemed to follow him wherever he went. There was something about him that was different from any other patient she had encountered. He was a man on the edge of something, and though she didn't know what that something was, she could sense the gravity of it. Elena had always prided herself on maintaining a professional distance from her patients. It was a necessary part of her job, a way to protect herself from the emotional toll of the work she did. But with Marco, that distance had begun to blur. She found herself lingering outside his room, her eyes drawn to him in moments when she should have been focused elsewhere. She told herself it was nothing, that it was just a passing curiosity about a patient with a complicated history. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The day of Marco's discharge was approaching, and the thought of him leaving the hospital brought an unexpected heaviness to Elena's heart. She knew it was irrational. He was just another patient, after all, but the connection they had shared, however silent and brief, felt important in a way she couldn't fully explain. She wondered what kind of life he would return to, what kind of dangers awaited him outside these walls. There was a part of her that wanted to ask, to know more about him, but she resisted the urge. She had no place in his life beyond the confines of this hospital. Marco, too, felt the weight of his impending departure. The outside world, with all its dangers and uncertainties, loomed large in his mind. He had spent years navigating the intricacies of the Mafia, balancing loyalty and survival, but for the first time in a long time, he questioned whether he could continue. His time in the hospital had given him a glimpse of something different, something quieter and more peaceful. It had shown him a life without constant threat, without the need for violence. But as much as he longed for that peace, he knew it wasn't his to keep. The Mafia wasn't something you simply walked away from. His life was entwined with theirs, and the choices he had made wouldn't just disappear because he wanted them to. Marco was a man with a past that would always catch up to him, no matter how far he tried to run. The morning of his discharge arrived, and with it came a sense of finality. Marco dressed slowly, his movements deliberate as he pulled on the clothes that had been left for him. His body was still stiff, his movements not yet as fluid as they once were, but he felt stronger than he had in weeks. The weight of the world outside began to settle back on his shoulders, and with it came the familiar tension of a life lived on the edge. Elena made her rounds as usual that morning, but her steps were slower than usual as she approached Marco's room. She knew he would be gone soon, and though she had no reason to, she felt a quiet sadness at the thought. As she entered the room, she found him sitting on the edge of the bed, his eyes focused on the floor. He looked up as she approached, their eyes meeting once again in that familiar silence. For a moment, neither of them moved. The unspoken connection that had been growing between them seemed to hang in the air, heavy and unacknowledged. Elena stepped forward, her hands moving to check the final details of his discharge. As she worked, she could feel his eyes on her, but she didn't look up. There was nothing to say, nothing that could change the fact that this was the end of whatever had been building between them. When her work was done, Elena turned to leave, but something made her pause at the door. She glanced back at Marco, who was now standing, his hand resting on the back of the chair. He gave her a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the time they had shared. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it spoke volumes. Elena nodded in return, and with that, she left the room, her footsteps echoing softly down the hallway. Marco remained where he was for a moment longer, his mind swirling with thoughts of what lay ahead. But as he walked out of the hospital and into the world he knew so well, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The connection he had shared with Elena, however brief, had left its mark. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, Marco allowed himself to imagine a different kind of life, one that didn't revolve around violence and survival. And though he wasn't sure if such a life was possible for someone like him, the thought of it lingered, refusing to fade as he walked back into the world that awaited him. Chapter 4. Return to the Shadows. The first breath of air outside the hospital was thick with the weight of reality. Marco stood still for a moment, the city sprawling out before him like an old friend he had both missed and dreaded. He had left the sterile safety of the hospital behind, but the weight of his world came crashing back as soon as his feet hit the pavement. The familiar tension in his muscles returned, the ever-present awareness of danger that had long been second nature to him. The streets around him bustled with life. Cars sped by, people walked hurriedly, and the hum of the city thrummed in the background, indifferent to his presence. But Marco saw beyond the surface. The world he belonged to existed in the shadows, invisible to those who went about their daily routines. It was a world of whispered deals, broken promises, and violence lurking beneath calm exteriors. As he stood there, Marco felt the pull of that world. The Mafia, with its web of obligations and unspoken rules, would never truly let him go. His absence from the streets had been temporary, and now he was expected to return. He could almost feel the eyes of his associates waiting for him, waiting to see if the Marco who had walked into the hospital would be the same man who came out. He knew he couldn't disappear, even if a part of him wanted to. The life he lived wasn't one where you simply walked away. There were debts to be paid, loyalties to uphold. His survival had come at a cost, and now that he was back, the expectations would be higher. He would need to prove himself again, to show that the wound that had nearly killed him had not weakened his resolve. Marco walked through the city with a practiced ease, his body instinctively alert for any sign of danger. It was a habit he had developed over years of navigating the streets, always aware, always prepared. The scars on his body were evidence of the life he led, each one a reminder of the risks he took in a world where trust was rare and betrayal was common. He made his way to a familiar corner of the city, one that had long been a meeting place for people like him. The old building stood in the shadows, its windows darkened, its entrance hidden from the casual passerby. Marco approached with caution, though he knew the space well. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the muted conversation of men who lived in the same world he did. This was the heart of the Mafia, quiet, hidden, but always alive. As he entered, eyes turned toward him. Some were surprised to see him on his feet again, others indifferent, their faces masks of stoicism. Marco knew they had expected him to return, but how he would be received was still uncertain. He had been away for weeks, and in the Mafia, absence was rarely without consequence. Loyalty was currency here, and it was constantly being tested. Marco moved through the room with a deliberate calm. He wasn't here to make a scene or draw attention to himself, but his presence was enough. His survival spoke volumes. The men who ran the operation here, men he had worked for, men who had sent him on that ill-fated job, watched him carefully. There were no words exchanged, no greetings or explanations. But in this world, none were needed. The fact that Marco stood before them, alive and healed, was enough. He took a seat at a small table in the corner, his eyes scanning the room. The tension that had been absent in the hospital returned in full force. Here, in this place, trust was a dangerous game. Marco knew better than to let his guard down, even among those he called allies. The faces around him were familiar, but loyalty in this world could shift in an instant. He had learned that the hard way. As Marco sat, the weight of his decisions began to settle over him. The life he led, the choices he had made, it was all catching up to him. The hospital had been an escape, a brief reprieve from the world he had known for so long. But now, that world had reclaimed him, and there was no running from it. The days that followed were filled with a return to routine. Marco resumed his place in the Mafia's operations, handling the jobs and tasks that came his way with the same efficiency he always had. His body had healed, and his mind was sharp, but something had changed. The connection he had felt in the hospital, the quiet peace that had come from being near Elena, lingered in his thoughts. It was a stark contrast to the life he lived now, a life where trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. He hadn't seen her since he had walked out of the hospital, but her image stayed with him, a quiet presence in the back of his mind. It was strange to him, how someone who had barely spoken to him could have such a lasting impact. But there it was, the thought of her, always hovering just beyond his immediate focus. In the quiet moments between jobs, between the violence and the tension, he found himself thinking of her. But Marco knew that whatever had passed between them was just a brief moment, an anomaly in the otherwise brutal reality of his life. He couldn't allow himself to dwell on it. The Mafia didn't forgive distractions, and he had to remain focused. There were things he needed to take care of, people who needed to be dealt with. His life, his survival, depended on it. As the weeks passed, Marco's world settled back into its familiar pattern. The nights were long, filled with meetings and deals made in darkened rooms. The days were quieter, but never truly peaceful. There was always the undercurrent of tension, the knowledge that at any moment, everything could change. But no matter how hard he tried to bury it, the memory of the hospital, of Elena, refused to fade. It was a strange kind of torture, a longing for something he couldn't have, something that didn't belong in his world. And yet, it was there, always, a quiet ache in the back of his mind. He knew he couldn't go back. The hospital had been a place of healing, but it wasn't a place he could return to. Elena, with her quiet grace and steady hands, belonged to a world far removed from his own. To bring her into his life, to even think about it, was dangerous. She was untouched by the violence that had shaped him, and he wouldn't allow himself to drag her into that darkness. Yet, despite his resolve, Marco couldn't help but wonder what might have been. In a different life, perhaps, things could have been different. But this was the life he had chosen, the life he was bound to. And as much as he wanted to imagine something else, he knew that this was his reality. So, Marco continued on, returning to the shadows, to the life he had always known. The city around him thrummed with the pulse of the Mafia, the ever-present undercurrent of danger and power. And though he moved through it with the same skill and efficiency he always had, something had shifted within him. The crossroads between the life he lived and the life he longed for had come and gone. And as much as he tried to stay in the shadows, a small part of him remained in the light, where Elena had unknowingly left her mark. Chapter 5. The Call of the Night. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the city as Marco made his way through the dimly lit streets. The night had always been his companion, a cloak that allowed him to blend into the background, invisible to the casual observer. Tonight was no different, though the weight of the evening felt heavier than usual. The city was alive in its usual rhythm. Cars passing by, late-night vendors packing up, the faint hum of distant sirens. But to Marco, it felt like the world was holding its breath. He had spent the last few weeks falling back into the rhythm of his life, each step calculated, each move made with precision. The Mafia had welcomed him back, but there was an unspoken tension beneath the surface, a sense that his time away had caused ripples in the order of things. His absence had not gone unnoticed, and though he had returned, the undercurrents of suspicion still lingered. Tonight, he was called to settle a debt, a job that had been waiting for him since his recovery. It was a reminder that his loyalty was constantly being tested, that his survival came with expectations he couldn't ignore. The message had been delivered earlier that evening. A brief note slipped under the door of his apartment. The location was familiar, the details sparse. It was how these things always were. The streets grew quieter as Marco made his way toward the outskirts of the city. The air grew colder, the buildings taller, casting long shadows that swallowed him as he walked. The further he moved from the center of the city, the more isolated he felt. The comfort of the crowd disappeared, leaving behind only the echo of his footsteps on the pavement. He reached an alleyway that branched off from the main road, its entrance marked by a single flickering streetlight. Marco paused for a moment, glancing down the narrow path before stepping into the shadows. The alley was silent, the air thick with the smell of damp stone and decay. It was a place he had been before, though every time felt different. There was always a sense of finality in these moments, a recognition that each meeting could be his last. As he walked deeper into the alley, Marco's senses sharpened. His mind was alert, his body tense. He had learned long ago never to let his guard down, especially in situations like this. The Mafia operated on a delicate balance of power and fear, and any misstep could tip the scales. He had survived this long by staying one step ahead, by reading the room before anyone else knew they were being watched. The alley opened into a small courtyard, empty except for a few abandoned crates and the faint glow of a cigarette ember in the far corner. Marco scanned the area, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. A figure stepped out from the shadows, moving slowly toward him. It was a man Marco recognized, one of the Mafia's enforcers, though his face was hard to see in the dim light. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement, just a nod of the head, a signal that the meeting was about to begin. More figures emerged from the shadows, silent as they took their places around the courtyard. Marco didn't flinch, though the tension in his chest tightened. He was used to these orchestrated meetings, where nothing was said, but everything was understood. The man with the cigarette took a step forward, tossing the stub to the ground before crushing it underfoot. His eyes met Marco's, cold and calculating. Marco knew what was coming. The job was simple enough: remove a problem, tie up a loose end. It was the kind of thing he had done 100 times before, though it never got easier. Each job was a reminder of the life he had chosen, the blood that stained his hands. Tonight would be no different. The man handed him a small slip of paper, the details written in barely legible scrawl. A name, an address, and a time. Marco glanced at it briefly before tucking it into his coat pocket. There was no need for questions. The instructions were clear, and the consequences of failure even clearer. Without a word, the men began to disperse, fading back into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared. Marco stood still for a moment, letting the quiet settle around him. The weight of the task ahead pressed down on his shoulders, though he had long since grown accustomed to carrying it. His life was a series of these moments, each one leading to the next, with no real end in sight. As the night deepened, Marco made his way back through the alley and onto the empty streets. The address was in a part of the city he knew well, one that had been touched by violence more times than he could count. It was a place where the lines between right and wrong blurred into nothingness, where survival meant being willing to cross those lines without hesitation. He moved quickly, his mind focused on the task ahead. The streets grew quieter as he neared his destination, the lights dimming, the air colder. The building was old, its windows dark, the paint peeling from the walls. Marco approached with caution, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The street was empty, though the silence felt unnerving. He entered the building through a side door, the creak of the hinges the only sound breaking the stillness. Inside, the air was stale, the smell of dust and rot filling his lungs. Marco's footsteps echoed as he made his way through the narrow hallway, each step bringing him closer to his target. The room he was looking for was at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. Marco paused for a moment, his hand resting on the doorframe. He knew what waited inside. Another loose end, another life that needed to be erased. He pushed the door open slowly, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room. A figure sat in a chair near the window, their back turned toward him. For a brief moment, Marco hesitated. The figure in the chair was smaller than he had expected, their posture slumped as though they had been waiting for this moment. There was no sound, no movement, just the quiet acceptance of what was to come. Marco stepped forward, his hand reaching for the weapon hidden beneath his coat. But something stopped him. The figure shifted slightly, their head tilting as though they sensed his presence. Marco froze, his mind racing. This wasn't the first time he had hesitated, but it was the first time the hesitation felt so overwhelming. The figure in the chair remained still, the room filled with the weight of unspoken choices. Marco stood there, his hand trembling slightly as the realization hit him. This was the moment, the crossroads between the life he had always known and the life he had glimpsed, however briefly, in the hospital. And for the first time in years, Marco wasn't sure which path to take. The silence in the room stretched on, the tension building with every passing second. And in that silence, Marco made a choice. Chapter 6. The Weighing of the Heart. Marco left the room, the weight of his decision trailing him like a shadow. The cold night air hit his face as he stepped out of the building, his mind churning with conflicting emotions. His footsteps, steady and purposeful, echoed off the empty streets, each step a reflection of the choices that had led him here. He had been a part of the Mafia for years, a willing participant in the cycle of violence that fed his existence, but tonight, something had shifted. He found himself wandering through the city, not in any hurry to return home. His mind replayed the events of the night, the figure in the chair, his hesitation, the choice to walk away. It was unlike him to falter, especially in situations that demanded swift and decisive action. But something inside him had changed since the accident, something that made him question the life he had lived for so long. The city stretched out before him, a vast expanse of lights and shadows, indifferent to the internal struggle that raged within him. Marco moved through the streets like a ghost, unnoticed and unbothered by the world around him. He passed by crowded bars and cafes, where laughter and conversation spilled out into the night, but it all felt distant, as though he was walking through a dream. He hadn't seen Gabriella in days. After their last encounter in the hospital, he had tried to bury the feelings that had surfaced, to convince himself that they were nothing more than a passing distraction. But the more he tried to forget, the more she haunted his thoughts. Her kindness, her gentle touch, the way she had cared for him when he was at his weakest, it all lingered in his mind, a stark contrast to the violence and coldness of his world. As Marco wandered aimlessly through the city, he found himself drawn toward the hospital. It wasn't a conscious decision, but rather a pull he couldn't resist. The building loomed in the distance, its bright lights a beacon against the darkness of the city. He slowed his pace as he approached, unsure of why he had come. The hospital was quiet, the usual hustle of the day replaced by the stillness of the night. Marco stood outside, staring up at the windows, wondering if she was inside. It had been weeks since he had last seen her, and though he had tried to put distance between them, the memory of their brief time together gnawed at him. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that Gabriella represented something he had lost long ago. Hope, redemption, a chance at something different. For a long time, Marco remained outside the hospital, his thoughts swirling. He wasn't a man who indulged in sentimentality or allowed himself to dream of a life beyond the one he had. But tonight, the idea of walking away from it all, of leaving behind the blood and the violence, felt more real than ever. His thoughts drifted back to the room in the alley, to the figure in the chair, and the choice he had made to spare a life instead of ending it. It was a small decision in the grand scheme of things, but to Marco, it felt like the first crack in the foundation of the life he had built. He had always been able to compartmentalize his actions, to separate the violence from who he was as a person. But lately, that line had begun to blur. As the minutes passed, Marco became more aware of the weight of the future pressing down on him. The Mafia would not tolerate disobedience. They would not overlook his hesitation, and they certainly wouldn't forgive him for walking away from a job. He had known from the beginning that there was no easy way out, that the life he had chosen came with a price. And yet, for the first time, he found himself wondering if it was a price he was willing to pay. The hospital doors slid open, and a nurse stepped outside, her shift likely over. Marco watched as she walked toward the parking lot, her footsteps soft against the pavement. He could have left then, could have turned his back on the building and disappeared into the night. But something kept him rooted to the spot, an invisible force that wouldn't let him walk away. Marco's thoughts returned to Gabriella. He hadn't been able to thank her, hadn't been able to tell her how much her presence had affected him. He had been too afraid of what it meant, too afraid to admit that she had shown him something he hadn't felt in years. Vulnerability, compassion, things that had no place in his world. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Marco turned away from the hospital. He hadn't come here for answers, but for clarity, and though his mind was still tangled in knots, one thing was clear. He couldn't continue down the path he was on. The Mafia would come for him eventually. They always did. But until that moment arrived, he had choices to make. He walked through the dark streets, the city now eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic. The weight of his decision lingered with each step he took, heavy yet liberating. The idea of change was terrifying, but the thought of remaining trapped in a cycle of violence, of being a tool for others' destruction, had become unbearable. As Marco approached his apartment, he was greeted by the silence of his empty life. The four walls of his small, sparse living space were a reflection of the emptiness inside him. He had nothing, no family, no future, no one who truly knew him. And yet, for the first time, the solitude felt suffocating. He had always taken comfort in the isolation, in the detachment that allowed him to function. But now, it only reminded him of everything he had lost, or perhaps had never even had. Sitting on the edge of his bed, Marco pulled out the slip of paper from his pocket, the one with the name and address of the man he had been sent to kill. He stared at it for a long moment before crumpling it in his hand and tossing it aside. That life was over. Whatever came next would be different, even if it meant walking into the unknown. The dawn was breaking as Marco lay back on the bed, exhaustion settling into his bones. His body ached, not from the physical toll of the night, but from the mental and emotional weight of his decisions. Tomorrow, everything would change. Whether that change would bring freedom or death, he didn't know. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace, a brief respite from the storm that awaited him. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the window, Marco closed his eyes, drifting into a restless sleep. The city continued to buzz outside, unaware of the quiet revolution taking place within him. And in the distance, the hospital stood as a silent reminder of the life he was leaving behind, and the life he was daring to dream of. Chapter 7. The Return. Days passed, and the weight of Marco's decisions began to settle deeper into his bones. He hadn't heard from the Mafia yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time. The life he had walked away from wasn't one that allowed for retirement or peaceful goodbyes. Even so, Marco felt a shift within himself, a distance growing between who he had been and who he was becoming. It wasn't just about leaving the Mafia, it was about something more fundamental. For years, he had been a ghost in his own life, moving through the world without ever truly feeling a connection to it. His existence had been defined by violence, by loyalty to a group that saw him as nothing more than a weapon. But since the accident, since Gabriella, everything had started to unravel. On a crisp, cool morning, Marco found himself standing outside the hospital again. He hadn't planned to come, but something had pulled him here. The place had become a symbol for him, a turning point, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was unfinished business between him and Gabriella. Not that there was anything to resolve. They had barely spoken, and yet, she had seen him at his most vulnerable. She had touched something inside him that he hadn't known was still there. Marco slipped into the hospital, moving quietly through the familiar corridors. The sterile smell of antiseptic, the soft hum of machines, the distant shuffle of nurses. It all brought him back to the weeks he had spent here after the accident. He remembered lying in the bed, too weak to move, too numb to care. Gabriella had been the first person to make him feel alive again, even if she hadn't meant to. As he made his way through the hallways, Marco felt the eyes of the staff on him. They remembered him, though none of them said a word. He had never been one to leave an impression, but the scars on his face and the intensity in his eyes made him hard to forget. He avoided their gazes, focusing instead on the task at hand. Finding Gabriella, he didn't know what he would say to her, or if he even needed to say anything at all. But the pull he felt toward her was undeniable, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was reckless, but Marco had never been one to shy away from danger. And Gabriella, despite her gentleness, felt dangerous to him in a way he couldn't explain. Finally, he spotted her. She was standing at the nurse's station, her white coat pristine, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She was busy, focused on a chart in front of her, completely unaware of his presence. For a moment, Marco just watched her, taking in the sight of her. So calm, so steady, so different from the chaos of his own life. Gabriella moved with a quiet grace, her hands deftly flipping through the pages of the chart, her face a mask of concentration. She didn't belong in his world, and yet, here he was, drawn to her like a moth to a flame. He had no right to be here, no right to pull her into the mess of his life. But still, he stayed. Marco's chest tightened as memories of the past few weeks flooded his mind. The near-death experience, the long recovery, the quiet moments when Gabriella had been there, checking his vitals, adjusting his offering him a presence that he hadn't known he needed. It had all seemed so insignificant at the time, but now it was all he could think about. Without thinking, Marco took a step toward her. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from something else, something raw and unfamiliar. He wasn't used to feeling this way, wasn't used to wanting something that had nothing to do with power or control. He wanted Gabriella, not in the way he had wanted other women, but in a way that terrified him. As he moved closer, Gabriella finally noticed him. Her eyes widened in surprise, and for a brief moment, they locked gazes. The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. Marco felt his throat tighten, the words he had practiced in his mind suddenly evaporating. But then, just as quickly as the moment had come, Gabriella's expression shifted. She gave him a polite nod, her professional mask slipping into place, and returned to her work. Marco froze, unsure of what to do next. He had expected something, a sign, a spark, anything to tell him that she felt what he felt. But instead, she had dismissed him with a nod, as if he were just another patient, just another face in the crowd. The rejection stung more than he cared to admit. He had never been one to chase after anyone, had never cared enough to. But with Gabriella, it was different. He had allowed himself to hope, and now that hope was slipping away. He stood there for a long moment, watching her as she moved from the nurse's station to the next patient's room. She was busy, preoccupied with her duties, completely unaware of the turmoil raging inside him. Marco felt a pang of bitterness rise in his chest. What had he been thinking? That he could just walk back into her life and everything would fall into place? That she would see him and know, instinctively, that he was different now? No, that was a fantasy. And Marco had never been one for fantasies. With a heavy heart, he turned away from the nurse's station and made his way back through the hospital. The sterile walls seemed to close in on him as he walked, the sounds of the hospital fading into the background. He had come here looking for something, maybe closure, maybe a second chance, but whatever it wasn't here. As Marco stepped out into the cool morning air, he felt the weight of his choices settle on his shoulders once more. He had tried to walk away from the life he had known, but it wasn't as simple as that. The past didn't just disappear, and neither did the scars it left behind. For now, Marco would go back to his empty apartment, back to the silence and the solitude. But he knew, deep down, that something had changed. Gabriella had opened a door inside him, and even though she might not feel the same way, Marco couldn't ignore what had been awakened. He wasn't sure what came next, if anything came next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt the stirrings of hope, fragile though it was. The path ahead was uncertain, dangerous even, but Marco had never been one to shy away from danger. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the city, Marco disappeared into the streets, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Chapter 8. Unseen Forces. The weeks that followed were heavy with a strange sense of anticipation for Marco. It was as if time itself had slowed, stretching out each moment, filling it with a tension that never quite broke. He felt the weight of the unsaid things between him and Gabriella, even though they had barely exchanged more than a few looks. It was that tension, the pull toward her, that nod at him, constantly in the background of his mind. But there were other things, too. Darker things. Marco's past was creeping back into his life, no matter how hard he tried to distance himself from it. The Mafia didn't forget people like him, and certainly didn't forgive anyone trying to leave. He knew it was only a matter of time before they made their move, and that thought loomed over him like a storm cloud. Late at night, Marco found himself awake, lying in his small, bare apartment, his mind drifting through memories he'd rather forget. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound from the street outside, sent his heart racing. The scars on his body had healed, but the ones in his mind had never left. Yet it was during the daytime, when he wandered the streets of the city aimlessly, that he felt most lost. He no longer belonged to the world he had known, the world of violence, power, and loyalty bound by fear. He didn't fit into any world, really. He was an outsider in every sense, adrift between the life he had left behind and the one he didn't know how to reach. It was always the hospital that drew him back, though, like a magnet pulling him towards something he couldn't yet define. Marco found himself returning to those familiar corridors, though he never had a reason to be there. He would sit for hours in the hospital cafeteria, nursing a cup of bad coffee, pretending to read a newspaper, but his eyes were always on the movement of the staff, searching for glimpses of Gabriella. And he always saw her, even if she didn't see him. Her presence was like a quiet balm to his troubled soul. He watched her work, graceful and focused, moving through her day with a calm precision. She had no idea what was stirring in his mind, the chaos that roared inside him as he sat there, hidden from her gaze. She didn't know that she had become his lifeline, the one thing tethering him to the hope that there was more to life than the shadows of his past. But it wasn't just Gabriella that kept Marco tethered to the hospital. It was also the growing awareness that danger was closing in around him. He had noticed things. Men he recognized from the old life, appearing in places they shouldn't be, watching him from a distance. The feeling of being hunted grew stronger each day, and Marco knew it was only a matter of time before they made their move. Yet he stayed. He didn't run, didn't hide. For the first time in his life, Marco didn't want to run from what he feared. Part of him had grown tired of being a ghost, tired of slipping through life without consequence. If they came for him, he would face them. If they wanted a fight, they would get one. But more than that, there was Gabriella. He couldn't walk away from her, even though he knew he should. She had no place in his world, and he had no place in hers. And yet, there was a connection there. One that neither of them had acknowledged, but that both felt. He couldn't deny it, no matter how much he tried to convince himself otherwise. One afternoon, as Marco sat in the cafeteria, the sense of being watched grew unbearable. He scanned the room with a careful, practiced eye, and his heart sank when he saw them. Two men, sitting at a table near the entrance, pretending to talk but glancing his way too often for it to be a coincidence. They were dressed in plain clothes, but Marco recognized them immediately. They were Mafia men, sent to keep an eye on him, to remind him that they hadn't forgotten. Marco's pulse quickened, and a surge of adrenaline shot through him. He was cornered, trapped in this mundane setting, unable to act without drawing attention. He thought about leaving, about disappearing into the streets and losing them in the city's labyrinth of alleyways. But something stopped him. Gabriella. She was nearby, working on another floor, completely unaware of the danger that had just stepped into her world. Marco knew he couldn't leave her unprotected. The Mafia didn't make idle threats, and they didn't hesitate to hurt the people you cared about. If they knew about his connection to her, and they likely did, she was in danger, whether she realized it or not. A deep, primal protectiveness surged through Marco. He wasn't going to let her be a casualty of his mistakes. But he couldn't confront the men now, not here. Not with so many innocent people around. He needed a plan. Marco left the cafeteria, walking quickly but not so fast as to draw attention. He made his way through the hospital's maze of hallways, his mind racing. He had to disappear for a while, to make them think he was gone, out of reach. But how could he do that and still protect Gabriella? As he moved through the sterile corridors, his eyes caught sight of her again. She was coming out of a patient's room, clipboard in hand, her expression calm and professional. She hadn't seen him yet, and Marco's heart clenched at the thought of what might happen if she became a target. He had to stay one step ahead of them, for both their sakes. That night, Marco made a decision. He gathered what few belongings he had, just a small bag of clothes, a burner phone, and a stack of cash hidden beneath a loose floorboard, and left his apartment behind. But he didn't leave the city. He couldn't, not while Gabriella was still at risk. Instead, he found a new place to stay, a small, unassuming room in a rundown building on the other side of town, far from the hospital but still close enough to keep an eye on things. For the next few days, Marco kept to the shadows, watching and waiting. He saw the men again, always lurking near the hospital, keeping tabs on him, but he stayed invisible, careful not to draw their attention. He was playing a dangerous game, one that could cost him everything. But Marco had never been afraid of danger. He had lived his whole life in its shadow, and now, for the first time, he had something worth fighting for. The storm was coming, and Marco could feel it. But this time, he wasn't running. He was ready to face whatever came next, because for the first time, he had a reason to fight, a reason to survive. Chapter 9. The Convergence. In the darkened room, Marco paced restlessly. The small, sparse space was a far cry from the opulent surroundings of his old life, but it was secure, at least for now. The weight of the situation bore down on him heavily. He had always been able to rely on his strength and cunning to navigate the dangers of his past life, but this was different. This was personal. The days blurred together as Marco waited. He kept a close eye on the hospital, observing the movements of the Mafia men who had become his unwelcome companions in the city. Their presence was a constant reminder of the life he had tried to leave behind, a life that had its claws deeply embedded in his soul. From his makeshift hideout, Marco set up a simple surveillance system. It was rudimentary but effective enough for his needs. He used a basic camera to monitor the entrance of the hospital and the surrounding streets. It wasn't a high-tech setup, but it allowed him to see if the Mafia men were still keeping an eye on things. Every few hours, he would check the footage, ensuring that no new threats had emerged. In the late afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marco's attention was drawn to a sudden flurry of activity at the hospital. He watched through the small window of his room as the Mafia men seemed to be gearing up for something. They moved with purpose and urgency, and Marco's instincts told him that a significant development was imminent. His heart raced as he quickly gathered his belongings. He needed to be close to the hospital, but he also had to avoid drawing attention to himself. He knew that any misstep could jeopardize Gabriella's safety. With everything packed, he slipped out of the room and made his way through the dimly lit streets. The city, usually so familiar, felt different in the growing darkness. The streets were shadowed, the corners more menacing. Marco moved swiftly and quietly, blending into the night. His eyes scanned the surroundings constantly, alert to any sign of trouble. As he approached the hospital, Marco noticed increased activity around the building. Cars were arriving and departing with an unsettling frequency. It was clear that something was happening, and the tension in the air was palpable. Marco's senses were heightened, every sound and movement magnified in the quiet of the night. He found a spot in the shadows near the hospital's back entrance, a vantage point that allowed him to see the comings and goings without being seen himself. From this concealed position, he watched as several men, Mafia enforcers, moved purposefully around the building. They appeared to be setting up some sort of operation, but the exact nature of their plan remained unclear. Marco's mind raced as he tried to piece together the situation. The men were clearly preparing for something, and it wasn't going to be good. He needed to act, but he had to be careful. Rushing in without a plan would only put Gabriella in more danger. Hours passed, and the night grew colder. Marco remained hidden, his body tense and alert. The Mafia men seemed to be waiting for something or someone. Marco watched as they communicated through hand signals and subtle gestures. There was a method to their movements, an order that suggested they were preparing for a coordinated effort. Finally, as the clock struck midnight, a new figure emerged from the shadows. Marco's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the man from his past, a high-ranking Mafia boss known for his ruthless efficiency. The boss's presence confirmed Marco's worst fears. The situation was escalating. The boss spoke briefly with the enforcers, and Marco saw the men nod in understanding. The tension in the air was now almost unbearable. Marco knew that whatever was about to happen would be significant, and he needed to be prepared. He watched as the enforcers began to move toward the hospital's main entrance, their demeanor serious and determined. Marco could only guess at their intentions, but the fact that they were so organized and focused was unsettling. He couldn't afford to be seen. He needed to stay hidden while he gathered as much information as possible. As the night wore on, Marco's anxiety grew. The Mafia's presence was a constant reminder of the danger Gabriella was in. He had hoped that by staying hidden, he could protect her from the worst of it. But the stakes were rising, and he had to act quickly to prevent any harm from coming to her. Just before dawn, the activity around the hospital began to wind down. The enforcers dispersed, their mission seemingly accomplished. Marco remained in his hiding spot, watching as the last of the Mafia men departed. The boss was the final one to leave, disappearing into the night with a sense of finality. Marco emerged from the shadows, his mind racing with thoughts of what he had witnessed. He needed to get back to his temporary hideout and reassess the situation. There was no way he could confront the Mafia directly without risking everything. He had to find another way to ensure Gabriella's safety. As he made his way back to his room, the weight of the night's events settled heavily on him. He had learned nothing concrete about the Mafia's plans, but he knew they were serious. The time for hesitation was over. Marco had to act, and he had to do it quickly. With a renewed sense of urgency, Marco returned to his hideout, determined to find a solution. He had to protect Gabriella and ensure that she remained safe from the impending danger. The Mafia was closing in, and Marco was running out of time. In the quiet of his room, Marco began to plan his next move. He would need to be strategic, careful, and above all, resolute. The storm was approaching, and he had to be ready to face it. For Gabriella's sake, and for his own, he could not afford to fail. Chapter 10: The Gathering Storm. Marco's new hideout was modest and secluded, nestled in a crumbling building on the edge of the city. It provided the anonymity he needed, but also left him isolated, the weight of solitude pressing heavily on him. Each night, as he lay on the thin mattress of his makeshift bed, the sounds of the city beyond the walls felt distant and cold, a constant reminder of the world he had left behind. Days were spent in a blur of constant vigilance and planning. Marco's once razor-sharp focus was now divided between monitoring the Mafia's movements and ensuring Gabriella's safety. He was acutely aware that any lapse in his vigilance could have dire consequences. The tension was palpable, a tightrope of fear and anticipation that Marco had to navigate with utmost care. His makeshift surveillance setup was rudimentary but sufficient. Each day, Marco meticulously reviewed the footage from his camera, trying to decipher the Mafia's patterns and intentions. The Mafia men continued their patrols around the hospital, but they seemed to be laying low, waiting for the right moment to act. Marco's frustration grew with each passing hour as he struggled to understand their plans. As the week progressed, Marco noticed a change in the patterns. The Mafia's activities became less frequent, but when they did occur, they were more intense. The feeling of an impending confrontation grew stronger, and Marco could sense that the storm was gathering. It was no longer a matter of if, but when the confrontation would occur. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marco decided to take a calculated risk. He needed to gather more information about the Mafia's plans, and the best way to do that was to get closer to the hospital. He carefully left his hideout and made his way through the dimly lit streets, his senses alert to every sound and movement. The city was quiet, almost eerily so. Marco's footsteps echoed softly as he approached the hospital's vicinity. The streets, usually bustling with life, were now deserted, adding to the sense of foreboding. Marco moved with purpose, but he remained cautious, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. He found a vantage point in an abandoned building across from the hospital. From this location, he had a clear view of the hospital's entrance and the surrounding area. Marco set up his makeshift surveillance equipment, ensuring that he had the best possible view of the activities unfolding below. The hours passed slowly as Marco waited, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. The Mafia men were still present, their movements deliberate and controlled. Marco noticed a new figure among them, a man whose demeanor was different from the others. He was more refined, his clothes more expensive, and he exuded an air of authority. This man was clearly someone of importance, and Marco's instincts told him that he was central to the Mafia's plans. As night fell, the activity around the hospital increased. The Mafia men moved with greater urgency, their actions more synchronized. Marco's heart raced as he watched, knowing that whatever was about to happen would be significant. The presence of the new figure added to the tension, signaling that the stakes were higher than ever. Marco remained hidden, his focus unwavering. He knew that any misstep could reveal his presence and jeopardize his plans. The night grew darker, and the sense of impending confrontation became almost unbearable. Marco's mind raced as he tried to piece together the information he had gathered, but the true nature of the Mafia's plan remained elusive. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the hospital's main entrance. Marco's heart pounded as he saw several men rushing towards the building, their movements frantic and disorganized. The new figure was among them, his face a mask of determination and urgency. Marco could only guess at the nature of the situation, but it was clear that something significant was happening. The chaos unfolded quickly, and Marco could barely keep up with the events. The Mafia men moved with purpose, their actions precise and calculated. Marco's eyes followed their every move, trying to understand their intentions. He knew that the situation was critical, and he needed to act quickly to protect Gabriella. As the night wore on, the activity around the hospital began to subside. The Mafia men retreated, their mission apparently completed. Marco remained in his hiding spot, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just transpired. The sense of danger was palpable, and he knew that he had to be ready for whatever came next. Returning to his hideout, Marco was filled with a sense of grim determination. The events of the night had heightened his resolve to protect Gabriella, no matter the cost. He knew that the Mafia's plans were far from over, and he had to stay vigilant. The days that followed were marked by a heightened sense of urgency. Marco continued to monitor the situation, gathering information and making plans. He knew that the storm was approaching, and he had to be prepared for the confrontation that was inevitably coming. Marco's focus remained on Gabriella. The thought of her being caught in the crossfire was a constant source of anxiety. He had to find a way to keep her safe, even as the danger drew closer. The Mafia's presence was a constant reminder of the precarious situation he was in, and Marco was determined not to let them succeed. Each night, as he lay in his sparse hideout, Marco's thoughts were consumed by the looming confrontation. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but he was resolute. He had faced danger before, but this was different. This was personal, and for Gabriella's sake, Marco was willing to do whatever it took to ensure her safety. The storm was coming, and Marco knew that he had to be ready. The Mafia was closing in, and time was running out. The final confrontation was drawing nearer, and Marco had to be prepared to face it head-on. The stakes were higher than ever, and there was no turning back. For Gabriella's sake, and for his own, Marco had to stand firm and confront the storm that was gathering on the horizon. Chapter 11. The Unraveling. The morning light filtered through the grime-covered windows of Marco's hideout, casting a muted glow on the sparse interior. The sense of urgency had become a constant companion, a relentless drive that pushed Marco to remain on high alert. Each day, as he analyzed the surveillance footage and reviewed the notes he had taken, the gravity of the situation became increasingly clear. The Mafia's intentions were murky, but their threat was undeniable. Marco had been spending long hours strategizing, piecing together the fragments of information he had gathered. He knew that he needed to act decisively to protect Gabriella. The Mafia's presence had escalated, and their operations were becoming more coordinated and sophisticated. The risk of an imminent confrontation was growing, and Marco could not afford to be caught off guard. One afternoon, Marco decided to take another risk. The information he had was insufficient, and he needed a closer look at the Mafia's activities. He carefully packed his belongings, ensuring that he took only what was essential. The weight of his decision hung heavily on him, but he was determined to find out more about the Mafia's plans. As he left his hideout, the city felt different. Its familiar streets now seemed fraught with danger. Marco moved cautiously, his eyes scanning for any signs of trouble. The sense of impending doom was palpable, and he felt as though he was walking on a knife's edge. He made his way to a new vantage point, a dilapidated building adjacent to the hospital. From this location, he had a clear view of the hospital's entrance and the surrounding area. The building was abandoned and unremarkable, but it provided the perfect cover for his surveillance. Marco set up his equipment, ensuring that he had a comprehensive view of the area. He watched as the Mafia men continued their patrols, their movements deliberate and controlled. The presence of the high-ranking boss remained a constant, a reminder of the threat that loomed over Gabriella. Hours passed as Marco observed the scene below. The Mafia men appeared to be engaged in a series of discussions and preparations. Their activities were intense, and the atmosphere was charged with a sense of urgency. Marco's frustration grew as he struggled to discern their plans. The lack of concrete information left him on edge, and he knew that time was running out. As night fell, Marco's anxiety reached new heights. The Mafia's operations seemed to be reaching a critical point. The men moved with increased efficiency, their actions more synchronized than ever. Marco's heart raced as he watched, knowing that the situation was escalating. The high-ranking boss was more active than before, directing the enforcers with a commanding presence. The sense of foreboding was overwhelming, and Marco could feel the weight of the impending confrontation pressing down on him. The Mafia's plans were becoming clearer, but the exact nature of their operation remained elusive. Suddenly, a new figure appeared on the scene. A man whose presence was marked by a sense of authority and menace. Marco's instincts told him that this man was central to the Mafia's plans. The figure's interactions with the enforcers were intense and purposeful, adding to the growing tension. The night wore on, and the activity around the hospital continued unabated. Marco remained hidden, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. The Mafia's preparations were thorough and methodical, and Marco knew that the confrontation was imminent. Returning to his hideout, Marco was filled with a sense of grim determination. The events of the night had only heightened his resolve to protect Gabriella. He knew that the storm was approaching, and he had to be ready for whatever came next. Days passed in a blur of anxiety and preparation. Marco continued to monitor the situation, gathering as much information as he could. The Mafia's presence was a constant reminder of the danger Gabriella faced, and Marco was determined to ensure her safety. One evening, Marco made another reconnaissance trip to the hospital. The atmosphere was tense, and the sense of impending confrontation was almost palpable. The Mafia men were more active than ever, their movements precise and deliberate. Marco watched from his vantage point, his heart pounding with anticipation. As the hours ticked by, the sense of urgency grew. The Mafia's operations were reaching a climax, and Marco knew that he had to act quickly. The high-ranking boss and the authoritative figure remained at the center of the activity, their presence a constant reminder of the threat that loomed over Gabriella. In the early hours of the morning, the activity around the hospital began to wind down. The Mafia men dispersed, their mission apparently completed. Marco remained in his hiding spot, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just transpired. The sense of danger was palpable, and he knew that he had to be prepared for the confrontation that was inevitably coming. Returning to his hideout, Marco began to plan his next move. The information he had gathered was crucial, but he knew that he needed to be strategic in his approach. The Mafia's plans were becoming clearer, but the true extent of their operation remained unknown. The days that followed were marked by a heightened sense of urgency. Marco continued to monitor the situation, gathering information and making plans. He knew that the storm was approaching, and he had to be ready for the confrontation that was drawing nearer. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but Marco remained resolute. He had faced danger before, but this was different. This was personal. For Gabriella's sake, and for his own, Marco was willing to do whatever it took to ensure her safety. The final confrontation was approaching, and Marco had to stand firm against the storm that was gathering on the horizon. Chapter 12. The Calm Before the Storm. The city had grown colder as autumn took hold, casting a chill into the heart of Marco's hideout. The once bustling streets seemed more desolate, their usual hum reduced to a distant echo. Marco's days were consumed by preparation and anticipation, his focus unwavering as he braced for the inevitable confrontation. His hideout, though modest, was meticulously organized. Maps and documents were spread out across a table, a visual representation of the complex web of danger that had become his life. Marco had spent countless hours studying every detail, trying to piece together the Mafia's plans and devise a strategy to protect Gabriella. The once familiar environment of the city had become a labyrinth of danger, each alley and corner a potential threat. The days were long, marked by intense periods of surveillance and strategic planning. Marco's routine was methodical. He would rise before dawn, check his equipment, and review the footage from his cameras. The Mafia's activities had become more sporadic, but the tension remained high. Marco knew that the calm was deceptive, a prelude to the storm that was fast approaching. One chilly morning, Marco decided to conduct a final reconnaissance mission. The sense of urgency had grown, and he needed to ensure that he had a comprehensive understanding of the Mafia's current operations. He carefully packed his gear, making sure to take only what was essential. The weight of his decision was heavy, but he was determined to see it through. As he left his hideout, the city streets seemed eerily quiet. The usual sounds of traffic and conversation were muted, replaced by a sense of foreboding. Marco moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. The city's familiar landmarks now appeared menacing, their once comforting presence a stark reminder of the threat that loomed. He made his way to a new vantage point, an abandoned warehouse overlooking the hospital. The building was decrepit, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. Despite its dilapidated state, it provided an unobstructed view of the hospital and the surrounding area. Marco set up his equipment with practiced precision, ensuring that he had the best possible vantage point. The hours passed slowly as Marco observed the hospital from his perch. The Mafia's activities had become less predictable, but there were still signs of their presence. The high-ranking boss and the authoritative figure were still active, their movements marked by a sense of purpose. Marco's eyes followed their every action, trying to discern any new developments. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped further. The cold seeped into the warehouse, making Marco's breath visible in the dim light. He remained focused, determined to gather as much information as possible before the night fell. The sense of impending danger was palpable, and Marco knew that he had to be ready for whatever came next. Nightfall brought a renewed sense of urgency. The hospital surroundings were now bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch ominously. Marco's vantage point allowed him to see the movements of the Mafia men with greater clarity. Their actions were deliberate, their movements synchronized. It was clear that they were preparing for something significant. The high-ranking boss and the authoritative figure continued to direct the enforcers, their presence a constant reminder of the threat that loomed over Gabriella. The Mafia's operations were methodical, their preparations thorough. Marco could sense that the final confrontation was drawing near, and he had to be prepared. As the hours ticked by, Marco's sense of anticipation grew. The Mafia's activities seemed to be reaching a climax, their preparations more intense than ever. Marco's heart raced as he watched, knowing that the storm was on the horizon. He needed to stay vigilant and be ready to act at a moment's notice. The night wore on, and the activity around the hospital began to wind down. The Mafia men dispersed, their mission apparently completed. Marco remained in his hiding spot, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just transpired. The sense of danger was palpable, and he knew that he had to be prepared for the confrontation that was inevitably coming. Returning to his hideout, Marco felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. The information he had gathered was crucial, but he knew that the final confrontation was still to come. The calm before the storm was deceptive, and Marco was determined to be ready for whatever lay ahead. In the quiet of his hideout, Marco reviewed the footage and notes he had collected. He meticulously examined every detail, trying to piece together the Mafia's plans. The sense of foreboding was overwhelming, but Marco's resolve remained unshaken. He knew that he had to act decisively to protect Gabriella. The days leading up to the confrontation were marked by a heightened sense of urgency. Marco continued to monitor the situation, gathering information and making plans. The Mafia's presence was a constant reminder of the danger Gabriella faced, and Marco was determined to ensure her safety. The calm before the storm was unsettling, but Marco remained resolute. He had faced danger before, but this was different. This was personal. For Gabriella's sake, and for his own, Marco was willing to do whatever it took to ensure her safety. The storm was gathering, and Marco had to stand firm against the threat that was drawing nearer. The final confrontation was approaching, and he had to be ready to face it head-on. Chapter 13. The Confrontation. The chill of winter had set in, enveloping the city in a blanket of snow and ice. The once bustling streets now lay silent, their usual activity muffled by the thick layer of snow. Marco's hideout was a stark contrast to the cold world outside. The small, dimly lit space had become a sanctuary of focus and determination. The impending confrontation loomed over Marco like a dark cloud, its presence felt in every decision he made. The previous nights had been marked by increased Mafia activity. Their operations had become more brazen, their movements more calculated. Marco had been vigilant, noting every detail and preparing for the inevitable clash. The high-ranking boss and the authoritative figure remained at the center of the chaos, their presence a constant reminder of the danger Gabriella faced. One frigid evening, Marco decided to conduct a final reconnaissance mission. The urgency of the situation left him with no room for error. He packed his equipment with care, ensuring that he had everything he needed. The weight of his decision was heavy, but his resolve was unwavering. He had to be prepared for the confrontation that was about to unfold. As he ventured into the snowy streets, Marco's breath formed visible clouds in the cold air. The city, shrouded in darkness and snow, seemed almost otherworldly. Marco moved with purpose, his senses heightened as he navigated the treacherous terrain. Each step was calculated, every movement deliberate. The familiar landmarks of the city had taken on a menacing quality, their once comforting presence now a stark reminder of the threat that loomed. Marco reached his vantage point, an abandoned building overlooking the hospital. The structure, though decrepit, offered an unobstructed view of the scene below. He set up his equipment with practiced precision, his hands moving deftly despite the cold. The anticipation was palpable, a sense of dread and determination that filled the space around him. From his vantage point, Marco observed the hospital and its surroundings. The snowfall had intensified, creating a ghostly white landscape that seemed to amplify the sense of impending doom. The Mafia men were already in position, their movements precise and deliberate. The high-ranking boss and the authoritative figure were present, their presence commanding and ominous. As the night progressed, Marco's sense of tension grew. The Mafia's preparations were methodical, their actions marked by a sense of purpose. Marco's eyes followed their every move, trying to discern the nature of their plan. The activity was frenetic, a stark contrast to the quiet snowfall that surrounded them. The temperature continued to drop, the cold seeping into Marco's bones. Despite the discomfort, he remained focused, his attention fixed on the unfolding scene. The Mafia men were engaged in a series of coordinated actions, their movements synchronized with a precision that spoke of careful planning. The high-ranking boss and the authoritative figure were central to the operation, their actions deliberate and commanding. Marco could sense that the confrontation was drawing near, the atmosphere charged with a palpable sense of urgency. The snowfall had turned into a blizzard, the swirling snow adding to the sense of chaos. As the hours ticked by, the activity around the hospital reached a fever pitch. The Mafia men moved with increased intensity, their actions more frenetic than before. Marco's heart raced as he watched, knowing that the moment of confrontation was imminent. The sense of impending danger was overwhelming, and he had to be ready for whatever was about to unfold. Suddenly, a new figure emerged from the shadows. The man's presence was marked by an air of authority and menace, his actions commanding the attention of the Mafia men. Marco's instincts told him that this figure was crucial to the unfolding events. The man's interactions with the high-ranking boss and the authoritative figure were intense and purposeful, adding to the growing tension. The snow continued to fall, its icy embrace creating a stark contrast to the heated activity below. Marco remained hidden, his eyes fixed on the scene. The Mafia's operations were reaching their climax, their preparations reaching a crescendo. Marco knew that he had to act quickly to protect Gabriella. As the night deepened, the confrontation began to take shape. The Mafia men were positioned strategically around the hospital, their movements precise and coordinated. The sense of anticipation was almost unbearable, and Marco's resolve was tested as he prepared for the inevitable clash. The blizzard raged on, the swirling snow creating a surreal backdrop to the unfolding drama. Marco's breath was visible in the cold air, his focus unwavering despite the harsh conditions. The Mafia's actions were deliberate, their plans coming to fruition with a disturbing precision. The tension reached its peak as the final preparations were made. Marco could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the sense of impending danger almost palpable. The confrontation was at hand, and Marco had to be ready to face it head-on. As the first signs of dawn began to break through the blizzard, the activity around the hospital reached its zenith. The Mafia men moved with urgency, their actions synchronized with a chilling efficiency. Marco watched with bated breath, his mind racing with thoughts of the impending clash. The snow continued to fall, its silent descent a stark contrast to the chaos below. Marco's resolve remained firm as he prepared for the confrontation. He knew that the moment he had been dreading was finally upon him, and he had to be ready to act with precision and determination. The blizzard raged on, its icy grip a constant reminder of the harsh reality that Marco faced. The Mafia's plans were reaching their climax, and Marco knew that he had to be prepared for whatever came next. The confrontation was at hand, and the storm that had been gathering was about to break. For Gabriella's sake, Marco had to stand firm and face the danger that was drawing nearer. The final confrontation was approaching, and he had to be ready to confront the storm with unwavering resolve. Chapter 14. The Storm Breaks. The storm raged with relentless fury, a tempest that mirrored the chaos unfolding within the city. The hospital, a beacon of hope amidst the turmoil, stood resolute against the battering winds and swirling snow. Inside, the sterile corridors and bustling staff were oblivious to the growing storm outside, where the conflict was reaching its peak. Marco's vantage point remained unchanged. The abandoned building overlooking the hospital had become his observation post, a grim witness to the escalating confrontation below. The blizzard had intensified, its icy fingers wrapping around the city like a vice. The snow fell in heavy, oppressive sheets, adding an element of surrealism to the unfolding drama. The Mafia's presence was more pronounced than ever. Their movements were synchronized with the storm's fury, a disturbing harmony between nature's chaos and human intent. The high-ranking boss and the authoritative figure were central to the operation, their actions deliberate and commanding. The urgency in their demeanor was matched by the ferocity of the storm, creating an atmosphere of palpable tension. As the blizzard howled, Marco's eyes remained fixed on the scene. The Mafia men had taken up strategic positions around the hospital, their preparations reaching a fever pitch. Their actions were methodical and precise, a stark contrast to the disordered weather. The sense of foreboding was overwhelming, and Marco could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The snow had begun to drift, its accumulation creating an almost impenetrable barrier around the hospital. The high-ranking boss and the authoritative figure continued to direct the enforcers, their commands sharp and urgent. Marco's heart pounded with a mixture of anxiety and determination as he watched, knowing that the final confrontation was imminent. The storm's ferocity matched the intensity of the Mafia's operation. The winds howled and the snow swirled in a chaotic dance, creating a surreal, almost apocalyptic backdrop. Marco's focus remained unwavering as he monitored the scene, his breath visible in the icy air. The Mafia's preparations had reached their climax. The enforcers moved with a sense of urgency, their actions precise and coordinated. The high-ranking boss and the authoritative figure were at the center of the storm, their presence a constant reminder of the threat that loomed over Gabriella. Marco's resolve was tested as he prepared for the confrontation that was about to unfold. The storm seemed to reach a crescendo, its howling winds and swirling snow creating a cacophony of sound. The blizzard's intensity mirrored the chaos below, amplifying the sense of impending danger. Marco's eyes followed the Mafia's every move, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. As the final preparations were made, Marco could sense that the moment of confrontation was at hand. The activity around the hospital was frenetic, the Mafia men moving with a disturbing efficiency. The snow continued to fall, its icy embrace a constant reminder of the harsh reality that Marco faced. The blizzard's rage showed no signs of abating. The winds howled and the snow drifted, creating a scene of almost apocalyptic desolation. Marco's determination remained unshaken as he prepared to face the storm that was gathering on the horizon. The confrontation was drawing near, and he had to be ready for whatever came next. As the first signs of dawn began to break through the storm, the tension around the hospital reached its peak. The Mafia's operations were at their zenith, their preparations reaching a climax. Marco's heart raced with anticipation as he watched, knowing that the final clash was imminent. The storm's intensity seemed to mirror the chaos below. The blizzard raged on, its icy grip tightening around the city. Marco's focus was unwavering as he observed the scene, his breath visible in the cold air. The Mafia's actions were precise and deliberate, their movements synchronized with a disturbing efficiency. The first light of dawn broke through the storm, casting a pale glow over the snow-covered landscape. The blizzard's fury seemed to wane, but the tension around the hospital remained palpable. Marco's resolve was tested as he prepared for the confrontation that was about to unfold. The final preparations were completed, and the Mafia men began to converge on the hospital. Their movements were deliberate, their actions marked by a sense of grim determination. Marco's heart pounded with a mixture of anxiety and resolve as he watched, knowing that the moment he had been dreading was finally upon him. The storm had subsided somewhat, its rage replaced by a heavy, oppressive stillness. The snow continued to fall, its silent descent a stark contrast to the chaos that was about to erupt. Marco remained hidden, his eyes fixed on the scene below. The confrontation was at hand, and he had to be ready to face the storm with unwavering resolve. As the Mafia men took their positions, Marco's sense of urgency grew. The final confrontation was at hand, and he had to act swiftly to protect Gabriella. The storm's fury had lessened, but the danger remained. Marco knew that the next moments would be crucial, and he had to be prepared to face whatever came next. The final clash unfolded with a sense of grim inevitability. The Mafia men moved with a disturbing efficiency, their actions precise and calculated. Marco watched with bated breath, his heart racing as the confrontation reached its climax. The storm had subsided, but the sense of danger was ever present. The first light of dawn revealed a city scarred by the storm's fury. The snow-covered streets were a testament to the chaos that had unfolded, and Marco's resolve remained firm. The confrontation had been a test of his determination, and he had faced the storm with unwavering resolve. Returning to his hideout, Marco felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The final confrontation had been intense, but the danger was far from over. He knew that he had to remain vigilant, his focus unwavering as he prepared for the next phase of the conflict. The storm had broken, but the battle was far from over. Marco's resolve remained unshaken, and he was determined to see the conflict through to its conclusion. For Gabriella's sake, and for his own, he had to stand firm against the storm that was gathering on the horizon. The final confrontation had been a test of his resolve, and he was prepared to face whatever came.